there is a sound I will never forget. It was the sound of my own uncle's voice, calm and cold, saying 5 words that broke something inside me forever. Someone has to be at the bottom. He said it while looking straight at me, across a dinner table I had paid for, in a house whose mortgage I had been quietly covering for almost 3 years. He didn't know I knew that. He didn't know that the woman he called the bottom was the only reason he still had a roof over his head. My name is Maya. I am 31 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that love meant sacrifice without complaint. I believed that family meant you gave, and never asked why. That belief nearly destroyed me. But it also taught me the most powerful lesson of my life. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. Let me take you back to where it all began. Not just to the dinner table, but further back, to the years that shaped me into the kind of woman who could disappear so completely inside her own family that no one thought to ask if she was tired, if she was struggling, if she had dreams of her own. I grew up in a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, the middle child between 2 brothers who were louder, bolder, and somehow always more noticed. My older brother, Zaid, was the golden boy, the first to finish university, the first to get a respectable job at a bank. My younger brother, Imran, was the baby of the family, spoiled a little, forgiven for everything simply because he was the youngest. And me? I was the quiet one. The reliable one. The one who never caused problems, which somehow, over the years, turned into the one who was never truly seen. My uncle Rashid, my father's younger brother, lived nearby, and he was always around. Big laugh, big opinions, and an even bigger sense of his own importance. As children, my brothers and I called him the loud uncle, not unkindly, just as a simple fact of who he was. He filled every room he entered. He told stories at every dinner, usually about himself, usually with himself as the hero. I remember, as a little girl, thinking he was larger than life. He would bring us small gifts, lift me onto his shoulders at family weddings, tell me I would grow up to be someone important. I adored him in those early years, the way children adore any adult who pays them attention. But even then, there were small signs, quiet, easy to miss, the kind of things you only understand looking back with adult eyes. He never remembered my birthday the way he remembered my brother's. He never asked about my schoolwork the way he asked about theirs. When I brought home top marks in mathematics, he laughed and said, "Good, good, numbers are useful for managing a household." When my brother Zaid brought home similar marks, Rashid took him out for ice cream and told him he would be a great businessman one day. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. In my uncle's mind, there was a place for men, and a smaller, quieter place for women. And I had been placed in that smaller room since childhood, long before he ever said the words, "Someone has to be at the bottom," out loud. When I was 22, my father passed away suddenly from a heart attack. It was the single most devastating event of my life. My father had been a gentle man, a quiet man, not unlike myself, someone who worked hard, spoke little, and loved deeply without needing to announce it. His death left a hole in our family that no one quite knew how to fill. My uncle Rashid stepped into that hole almost immediately, and at first, we were grateful. He organized the funeral arrangements. He handled the paperwork none of us understood. He sat with my mother for hours, helping her navigate widowhood in a world that suddenly felt enormous and frightening. For a while, I believed he was doing this purely out of love for his brother's memory. It took me years to realize that stepping into that role also gave him something else: power. Authority. A permanent seat at the head of our family table, one that no one, especially not my grieving mother, felt strong enough to question. My mother, gentle and tired from years of quiet struggle, looked up to him completely after that. My brothers respected him because he was older, because tradition told them to. And me? I learned early that in that family, my role was to listen, to help, and never to expect anything back. I built my career slowly, the way I built everything in my life, carefully, without shortcuts. I studied finance at a local university, took on extra tutoring jobs to help with tuition, and by 26, I had a stable position at a private accounting firm downtown. I wasn't rich. I wasn't glamorous. But I was disciplined, and I saved every rupee I could, quietly building a small nest egg I told no one about, not even my mother. I had dreams, even if I never spoke them aloud at family dinners where dreams belonged only to my brothers. I wanted my own apartment, small, simple, but mine. I wanted, one day, to start a small financial consulting business, helping women in particular understand money in a way no one had ever taught me growing up. I had spreadsheets on my laptop with 5-year plans, 10-year plans, numbers I revisited late at night with a quiet kind of hope that felt almost like a secret. Then, one evening in early spring, 3 years before that fateful dinner, my uncle called me in a panic. It was a call unlike any I had received from him before. His voice, always so certain, so commanding, now trembled with something I had never heard in him, fear. "Maya, Beta, I need your help. Just this once." I remember sitting up straighter on my bed, startled by the crack in his voice. "Uncle, what's wrong? Are you okay? Is Aunt Salma okay?" We're fine," he said quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's the house. The mortgage. I'm 3 months behind, Maya. The bank sent a letter. If I don't pay soon, they'll start the foreclosure process. I could lose everything." I sat in silence for a moment, processing this. My uncle, the man who always seemed so confident, so in control, the man who lectured us all on financial discipline at every family gathering, was on the verge of losing his home. "How did this happen?" I asked gently. He explained, in halting, embarrassed sentences, that he had invested a large portion of his savings into a small textile business venture with a business partner who had, in the end, mismanaged the funds and disappeared with what remained. He hadn't told anyone. Not my mother, not his own wife's extended family, not my brothers. "I don't want your mother to know," he said, his voice dropping to something almost pleading. "I don't want to look weak in front of the family, Maya. You understand numbers. You're smart with money, smarter than any of us, honestly. Please. Just help me this one time. I will pay you back, I promise. I just need to get through these next few months." I remember sitting on my bed that night after the call ended, staring at my savings account on my laptop screen. I had been saving for nearly 4 years toward a down payment on my own apartment. The number wasn't huge, but it represented something enormous to me: independence, a life of my own, proof that all those years of quiet discipline meant something. But this was family. This was the man who used to carry me on his shoulders at weddings, before the weight of adulthood and loss had hardened all of us into different versions of ourselves. I thought of my father, and what he would have wanted me to do for his younger brother. I thought of my mother, and how devastated she would be to learn that Rashid was struggling and no one had helped him. I said yes. That, one time, became a monthly transfer. Quietly, without ceremony, I began paying a portion of his mortgage every single month, transferring the money directly to his account 2 days before the due date, always with the same simple message: sent. Let me know if it's not enough. At first, it was just to cover the gap between what he could pay and what the bank required. Then, as his business losses continued and his other debts mounted, it became the entire monthly payment. I told myself it was temporary, that he would recover, find new work, take it back over within a year at most. I told myself this was what family did for each other, that this was the kind of quiet, unglamorous love my father had always modeled for us. But what I didn't know that day was that this temporary help would become a chain around my own future, a chain I willingly wore for 3 long years, while the very man I was saving from ruin would one day look me in the eye, in front of our entire family, and call me nothing. I never told my mother. I never told my brothers. I didn't want anyone to see Rashid as weak, and honestly, if I am being completely truthful in this telling, I also didn't want anyone to know how much of my own dreams I was quietly setting aside to protect his pride. There is a strange, complicated shame in sacrifice sometimes. You want credit for it, and yet you are terrified of being seen giving it, as though the giving itself might be judged, questioned, picked apart. So I stayed silent. Every month, I watched a piece of my future disappear into his bank account, and every month, I told myself it was an investment in family unity, in honoring my father's memory, in being the kind of daughter and niece who didn't abandon family when things got hard. I want you to understand something about me at this point in the story. I was not naive. I was not blind. I saw the way my uncle continued spending money on things he didn't strictly need: new furniture for the living room, an expensive new phone for himself, a lavish celebration when his son got a promotion at a local firm, while I sat quietly transferring funds behind the scenes to keep his house from being taken away. I saw it, and for a long time, I said nothing. Because that is what a good niece does. That is what a good daughter of the family does. She swallows her feelings and keeps the peace, especially when speaking up might make her the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the one who doesn't understand family. There were nights I sat with my calculator open beside my laptop, quietly running numbers, watching my own 5-year plan stretch further and further into the distance. My apartment fund, frozen. My business idea, shelved indefinitely. My emergency savings, thin as paper. And still, every month, I sent the money, because the alternative, watching my father's brother lose the home he had built his life around, felt unthinkable. There was a specific night, the night everything truly began to change, when my uncle hosted a big family dinner. It was meant to celebrate his son's promotion at work, a mid-level management position at a logistics company that Rashid described to everyone as though his son had been personally selected to run the entire industry. The table was full of relatives, laughter, the smell of biryani and fresh naan drifting from the kitchen, the low hum of a dozen conversations happening at once. I sat there quietly, exhausted from another long week of double shifts, my regular job during the day, freelance accounting work at night, just to keep up with both my own expenses and his mortgage payments. I had barely slept more than 5 hours a night for weeks. My eyes were tired. My smile, I'm sure, looked a little forced, though no one at that table seemed to notice. My mother sat beside me, proud, the way she always looked at family gatherings, believing everyone around the table loved each other equally, believing the family my father had left behind was still whole and healthy in the way he would have wanted. My uncle, halfway through a glass of celebratory whiskey, stood and began one of his usual speeches about success, about hard work, about how a family rises together when everyone plays their part. I had heard versions of this speech a dozen times before. I usually let it wash over me, background noise to the exhaustion I was carrying. And then, almost as a joke, almost as if it meant nothing at all, he looked around the table and said the words that would define the rest of this story. "You see," he said, raising his glass slightly, his voice warm with the confidence of a man who believed every word he said, "in every family, someone has to be at the top, and someone has to be at the bottom, carrying the weight so others can shine. That's just how it works. That's how any successful structure works, a business, a family, a house. You need a strong foundation nobody notices, so the rest of the building can rise." Everyone laughed, a light, easy laugh, the kind that comes from a room full of good food and comfortable company. It was meant, I think, as a toast, a joke about hierarchy in business, something he'd probably heard at some seminar and decided to repeat because it made him sound wise. And then his eyes landed on me. The quiet niece who never spoke up much at these dinners, who always seemed a little tired, who never had exciting career news or engagement announcements to share the way my cousins did. And he added, almost carelessly, almost affectionately in his own mind, but with a cruelty that would echo in me for months afterward. "Isn't that right, Maya? Someone has to be at the bottom." The table laughed again. My cousins chuckled, a few of them glancing at me with the kind of gentle, teasing smiles people give when they think a joke is harmless. Even my mother gave a small, awkward smile, not quite understanding the weight behind those words, perhaps assuming it was simply Rashid's usual blunt humor. But I understood. I understood completely. Because at that exact moment, I was the one holding up the very table he was standing behind. I was the one who had paid for half the ingredients in the biryani everyone was enjoying, because I had transferred extra that month when he mentioned the party was putting a strain on things. I was the one who had quietly, invisibly, saved the house we were all sitting inside from being taken by the bank 18 months earlier. And he called me the bottom. I smiled that night. I even laughed along, a small, polite sound, because that is what I had trained myself to do for years: absorb the discomfort, swallow the hurt, keep the peace. But something inside me, something that had been stretched thin for 3 years, silently, invisibly, finally, quietly, cracked. That night, driving home alone in the dark, my hands tight on the steering wheel, I replayed his words over and over. Someone has to be at the bottom. I thought about every transfer I had made. Every month I had told myself, just a little longer. Every dream I had set aside without telling a single soul. And I made a decision that would change everything. I decided I would no longer be invisible. I decided that the next chapter of my life would not be written in silence. The weeks after that dinner were strange, heavy in a way I struggled to explain even to myself. I went to work as usual, sat through meetings, reviewed spreadsheets, smiled at colleagues. I attended family gatherings as usual, nodding along to conversations, helping clear dishes, listening to my mother recount neighborhood gossip on the drive home. But something inside me had shifted permanently, like a foundation stone quietly settling into a new position after years of pressure. I began to see my uncle differently, not as the flawed but well-meaning family elder I had convinced myself he was for years, but as a man who took, and never once looked back to see who was giving. I started paying closer attention to the small comments, the subtle dismissals, the pattern I had somehow trained myself not to notice for so long. I started asking quiet questions too, gathering small pieces of information the way I gathered numbers at work, carefully, patiently, without anyone noticing. I spoke casually with my cousin Sarah, Rashid's niece on his wife's side, who mentioned offhandedly that Uncle Rashid had told her mother his textile business was recovering beautifully, better than ever. I spoke with my brother Zaid, who mentioned Rashid had told him, months earlier, that he had handled a rough financial patch himself, the way a man should. And what I found broke my heart in a different way than the dinner had. My uncle had told the rest of the family a completely different story about his finances. He told my brothers that his textile business was thriving again through his own sharp decisions. He told my mother, my own mother, that he had worked through a difficult period himself, quietly, the way your husband would have wanted, without burdening anyone. He even told his own wife, my Aunt Salma, according to something Sarah let slip one afternoon, that a generous old friend from university had helped him through a tight spell financially, never once mentioning my name, never once acknowledging the truth of who had actually kept his family in that house for 3 straight years. I was not just invisible. I was erased from my own sacrifice, rewritten out of the very story of survival I had made possible. It is one thing to sacrifice quietly because you choose to, because it feels like an act of love freely given. It is another thing entirely to discover that your sacrifice has been rewritten into someone else's story of self-made success, polished and retold at dinner parties as evidence of his own resilience and wisdom. That was the moment the pain of "someone has to be at the bottom" truly settled into my bones. Not because of the insult itself, sharp as it was, but because of everything it revealed underneath it, the years of being used, the years of being unseen, the years of being both essential and invisible at the very same time. I remember calling my closest friend, Nyla, that week, unable to hold the weight of it alone any longer. We had been friends since university, and she was the only person who had even a partial sense of how much I had been struggling, though even she didn't know the full extent until that phone call. I told her everything, the payments, stretching back 3 years. The dinner, and the words that had cut through me in front of the entire family. The discovery of his lies, dressed up as his own hard-won success. She listened quietly on the other end of the line, occasionally letting out a small, sharp breath of disbelief, but mostly just listening, the way a true friend does when someone finally opens a door they've kept locked for years. When I finally stopped talking, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me one simple question that I couldn't answer. "Maya, what do you want?" Not what's best for the family. Not what keeps the peace. What do you actually want, for yourself, in all of this? I sat in silence on the phone for a long time, the question hanging in the air between us like something fragile. I realized, with a kind of quiet horror, that I hadn't truly asked myself that question in 3 years. I had asked what Rashid needed. What my mother needed. What the family needed to look stable and united from the outside. I had never once, in 3 years, stopped to ask what Maya needed. That week, I did something I had never done before. I opened a private folder on my laptop, hidden behind 2 layers of subfolders no one would ever think to look through, and I began documenting everything, every transfer, every date, every conversation where my uncle had asked for just a little more help this month. I told myself it was just for my own peace of mind, a way to see the truth clearly laid out in black and white instead of carrying it as a vague, painful feeling that kept me up at night. But somewhere deep down, if I am honest with you now, I think I already knew I was building something more than a record for myself. I was building evidence of the truth, in case the day ever came when I needed to speak it aloud. Meanwhile, my uncle's behavior grew worse, not better, in the months that followed. Now that his financial pressure had eased, thanks entirely to me, though he never once framed it that way even to himself, he became bolder, more confident, more openly dismissive of the people around him, myself included. At the next family function, a smaller gathering to celebrate my Aunt Salma's birthday, he made another comment, this time about my quiet, uneventful life, comparing it directly to his son's rising career and his older nephew's recent engagement. Maya here, he said with a chuckle, gesturing toward me with his glass, she's steady, dependable, not much excitement in her world, but someone has to keep things simple, eh? He laughed, and a few relatives laughed politely along with him, unsure of what else to do. I smiled, the way I always did, but inside, something tightened. I saw the pattern clearly now, laid out like one of my own spreadsheets. He built himself and his son up by quietly putting me down, comparing our lives as though mine held less value simply because it was quieter, less announced. He never realized, or perhaps, more painfully, he never cared to realize, that the very ground he stood on, the very house hosting that birthday party, was ground I had paid for. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from being underestimated by someone you have secretly carried on your own shoulders for years. It is not loud. It does not scream or demand attention. It sits quietly in your chest, day after day, meeting after meeting, dinner after dinner, until one day you realize you have been holding your breath for years without even noticing. I began pulling back, not dramatically, not with confrontation, not yet, but quietly, strategically, the way I approached everything in my life. I reduced my monthly transfer by a modest amount one month, telling him I was going through a tight month at work, bonuses got delayed. I watched his reaction closely, almost like a scientist observing a control. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask why, or offer to help in any way, or even express concern for my sudden tight month. He simply replied, 2 days later, with a slightly clipped message, okay, but please try to send the full amount next month. The due date doesn't move just because your bonus is late. That was the moment I understood, with complete and total clarity, that this had never been about family love in the way I had told myself it was. It had been about convenience. I was convenient. I was reliable. I was, in his eyes, exactly what he had called me at that dinner months earlier, the bottom, the foundation nobody thanks, the floor everyone stands on without ever once looking down to see what it costs to hold that weight. But floors, I would soon show him, can crack. And when they do, everything built on top of them comes down together. I began quietly rebuilding my own foundation instead, brick by brick, the same patient way I had always approached my finances. I met with a financial advisor, not for him this time, for myself, for the first time in over 3 years. Her name was Priya, and she was blunt in the kindest possible way. She asked me to lay out, in complete detail, everything I had given over the past 3 years, every transfer, every skipped opportunity, every delayed plan. I calculated exactly how much I had given him. 36 months of payments, some full, some partial, averaging out to a number that staggered me when I finally saw it typed out on Priya's screen in front of me. It was enough for the full down payment on my own apartment, with money left over. It was enough to have started the small financial consulting business I had once dreamed of, with a proper cushion for the slow early months. It was enough to have built a real emergency fund, one that would have let me breathe freely instead of running myself into quiet exhaustion every single month for 3 straight years. Priya looked at the number, looked at me, and said gently, Maya, I need you to understand something. This wasn't generosity anymore, somewhere around month 8 or 9. This became something else. And you deserve to name that clearly for yourself, even if you never say it to him. I did not confront my uncle yet. I was not ready, not emotionally, not strategically. Confrontation without a plan, I had learned watching other family arguments over the years, is just noise, loud, messy, easily dismissed as emotional or dramatic, easily used against the person who dares to speak up first. And I did not want to be noise. I wanted to be certain. I wanted to be strong enough and prepared enough that when I finally spoke, no one could dismiss what I said as simply an emotional outburst from sensitive Maya. So instead, I began preparing quietly, the way I had always done everything in that family, without anyone noticing, without announcement, brick by careful brick. I spoke to a lawyer friend from university, carefully, hypothetically at first, about my rights regarding the money I had transferred, since much of it had gone toward mortgage payments technically in his name, on a property I had no legal claim to. I learned that while I had no legal ownership stake in the house itself, I had every right to stop the payments at any time I chose, without warning if necessary, and every right to tell the truth about what I had done, clearly and without exaggeration, to whoever I chose to tell. That truth, I realized sitting in my car outside my lawyer friend's office, was the only weapon I truly needed. Not revenge in the traditional, dramatic sense people imagine, not sabotage, not cruelty, not trying to destroy him publicly out of spite. Just the truth, spoken clearly, calmly, at the right moment, in front of the people who mattered most. Weeks passed, then months. My uncle, unaware of the storm quietly forming behind his comfortable, rebuilt life, continued his pattern, spending a little more freely now that the pressure had eased, boasting at every gathering about his hard-won recovery, occasionally tossing out another careless remark about hierarchy, about people who just don't have what it takes to rise the way some of us do. Each comment landed differently on me now. Not as small cuts to be absorbed silently, but as small stones I quietly collected, adding weight to a decision that was slowly but steadily taking shape inside me. I also began, during this period, quietly rebuilding my own life outside the shadow of his needs. I picked up 2 new freelance accounting clients, small business owners who paid promptly and appreciated my work without ever once comparing me unfavorably to a male relative. I started sketching out, late at night in a fresh notebook, an actual business plan for the consulting practice I had once only dreamed about, a service specifically designed to help women, especially women in families like mine, understand and protect their own finances instead of quietly sacrificing them for others. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar stirring inside me alongside the exhaustion and the hurt, a small, steady flame of purpose. Then came the night that changed everything, the night of my cousin's engagement party, Rashid's son's engagement, the biggest family event of the year, planned and hosted in the very house I had been secretly protecting from foreclosure for 3 long years. Every relative was invited. Neighbors, family friends, extended cousins from other cities traveled in for the occasion. Strings of warm lights decorated the front garden. Caterers moved through the house with trays of appetizers. My uncle stood at the center of it all that evening, glowing with pride in a crisp new sherwani, thanking guests warmly for coming to celebrate everything he had built for his family. I remember standing near the back of the main room that night, a small glass of juice in my hand, watching him accept compliments about his beautiful home, his successful, rising son, his strong family values passed down through generations. Compliments for a house I had saved from the bank. Compliments for stability I had funded, month after month, while quietly setting aside my own future. And I remember feeling, for the first time in 3 long years, not sadness, not even anger exactly, but a strange, steady clarity, like fog finally lifting from a familiar road. I was done being the bottom. I was done being the quiet, invisible foundation for someone else's spotlight, someone else's story of triumph that conveniently forgot to mention my name even once. That night, standing in the corner of that beautifully decorated room, surrounded by laughter and celebration I had quietly helped make possible, I made my decision. I would not shout. I would not create an ugly scene out of anger, however justified that anger might have been. I would simply tell the truth, calmly, clearly, and completely, in front of the very people who had laughed along with his cruel joke months earlier, in front of the family who deserved, finally, to see the whole picture instead of the polished version Rashid had been selling them for years. Because the truth, when spoken with quiet confidence instead of rage, is often the most powerful revenge of all. The engagement party was in full celebration when I finally asked to speak. It wasn't dramatic, not in the way it might play out in a film. I didn't storm to the front of the room. I didn't raise my voice or slam anything down on a table. I simply walked up to my uncle as he was preparing to give another one of his proud, sweeping speeches to the assembled guests, and I asked him quietly, gently, if I could say a few words too, to celebrate the family on such a special night. He smiled, mildly surprised, probably assuming I would offer some short, forgettable blessing for the happy couple, the way I usually did at these events, a quiet, easily forgotten sentence or two before returning to the background where I had always stood. He gestured for me to join him near the small platform set up for speeches, clearly pleased that, quiet Maya, wanted to say something for once. I looked around the room as I stepped forward, my mother near the front, smiling proudly, my brothers standing together with drinks in hand, my Aunt Salma beaming beside her son and his fiancée, cousins, family friends, neighbors, all smiling, all waiting, all completely unaware of what was about to unfold. My heart was pounding, but my voice, when it came, was steady. I want to congratulate my cousin on his engagement, I began, letting the warmth in the room settle for a moment before continuing. This is a beautiful home, and tonight is a beautiful celebration. I'm truly happy for both of you. I paused, taking a small breath. But I think it's important, on a night about family, honesty, and new beginnings, that everyone here knows the full truth about how this beautiful home was kept in our family these past 3 years. The room grew quiet, the kind of quiet that spreads through a crowd like a ripple across still water. My uncle's smile faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, though he still didn't fully understand what was coming. 3 years ago, I continued, my voice calm despite the pounding in my chest, Uncle Rashid came to me privately and asked for help. His business had failed, and he was 3 months behind on this house's mortgage. The bank had already sent a warning letter about foreclosure. He asked me to help him, just once, he said. I said yes, because that is what family does for each other. I could feel every eye in the room shifting toward him now, then back to me, then back to him again, a slow wave of understanding beginning to move through the crowd. That, one time, became every single month, for 3 years. I have paid, in full or in significant part, this house's mortgage for 36 months. I did it quietly, because I didn't want anyone to think less of him during a difficult time. I did it because I believed, truly and completely, that this was what love and loyalty were supposed to look like inside a family. My Aunt Salma's hand rose slowly to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with a shock I had never seen on her calm, composed face before. My mother's eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, heartbreak, and something that looked almost like betrayal, not at me, but at the reality settling over her, looking at her brother-in-law as if seeing him clearly, truly, for the first time in years. I'm not sharing this to embarrass anyone tonight, I continued, my voice softening slightly, though it did not waver. I'm sharing this because a few months ago, at a dinner in this very house, Uncle Rashid made a joke. He said that in every family, someone has to be at the bottom, carrying the weight so others can shine. And he looked directly at me when he said it. I turned to face him fully now, and for the first time in my entire life, I did not look away from his eyes. I want you to know, Uncle, that I was never at the bottom. I was the foundation. And foundations don't ask for applause, or credit, or even acknowledgement most of the time. But they do deserve respect. They deserve, at the very least, to not be mocked by the very people standing on top of them. The silence in that room was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life, heavy, complete, stretching for what felt like a full minute though it was probably only a few seconds. My uncle stood frozen, his face slowly draining of color, his usual booming confidence completely stripped away in front of the very audience he had spent years building his pride upon. He opened his mouth once, twice, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, as far as I knew, the loudest man in every room had absolutely nothing to say. My mother was the first to move. She walked over to me, tears already forming in her eyes, and took my hand tightly in both of hers, whispering an apology for not seeing what I had been quietly carrying alone, for not asking the right questions, for trusting a version of events that had never once included the full truth. My brothers looked at Rashid with a mixture of disbelief and quiet, simmering anger, the comfortable illusion of his self-made success shattering visibly in front of them, replaced by a much harder, more complicated picture of the uncle they had respected without question for years. His own son, the groom-to-be, looked between his father and me with an expression of confused hurt, clearly trying to reconcile the proud stories he'd grown up hearing with this new, unfamiliar version of events. I didn't ask for revenge that night, not in any dramatic sense. I didn't demand my money back in front of everyone, though eventually, in the weeks that followed, my uncle, humbled, ashamed, and facing the quiet, lasting judgment of a family that finally saw him clearly for the first time, insisted on repaying every rupee, setting up a formal, documented repayment plan without me even asking him to. I didn't need to destroy him publicly or make a bigger scene than the truth itself required. The truth alone was enough. Because the moment his family saw the real story, laid bare and undeniable, the throne he had quietly built on my silence for 3 years simply collapsed on its own weight. In the days immediately following the engagement party, the house felt different whenever I visited, quieter in a new way, heavier with unspoken conversations happening in corners and side rooms. My Aunt Salma called me privately, tearfully, apologizing for things she hadn't even known to apologize for, promising that things would be different going forward. My uncle himself came to see me about a week later, alone, without the usual confidence in his step. He sat across from me at a small cafe near my office, turning his teacup slowly in his hands before finally speaking. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "how to say thank you all those months. I think somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing it as help, and started seeing it as something owed to me. That's not an excuse. I know that's not an excuse." I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence sit between us, the way I had once let his careless words sit unanswered for far too long. "I'm sorry, Maya," he finally said, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "For the joke. For all of it. You were never the bottom. You were the reason any of us were still standing." I accepted his apology, though I told him honestly that trust, once broken so completely, rebuilds slowly, in small steady steps, not all at once with a single conversation over tea. He nodded, understanding, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it meant to be on the receiving end of quiet, patient rebuilding rather than the one demanding it from someone else. In the months that followed, our relationship changed completely, though not overnight, and not without ongoing effort on both sides. My uncle, stripped of his false image in front of the family he cared about most, became noticeably quieter at gatherings, more careful with his words, occasionally even deferring to my opinion on financial matters in a way he never had before. He apologized to me privately more than once during those months, though I could see that true, deep understanding of what he had done to me would take him much longer to fully grasp than a single tearful conversation over tea. Some wounds don't heal with a single apology, however sincere. But something had shifted permanently between us, a truth now stood clearly where years of silence used to be, and that alone changed the entire shape of our relationship going forward. I used the repayments, along with the money I finally stopped sending every single month, to do something for myself for the first time in over 3 years. I put a down payment on a small apartment of my own, modest, simple, nothing extravagant, but entirely mine, built entirely on my own effort and my own name on the paperwork. I started the beginnings of a small financial consulting practice on the side, helping other quiet, overworked people, many of them women like myself, understand and protect their own financial worth, the way I wished someone had helped me understand years earlier, before 3 years of my life quietly disappeared into someone else's mortgage payments. Looking back now, from the distance of time and healing, I understand something I couldn't fully see in the middle of all that pain. Being the bottom was never a weakness. It was never something to be ashamed of, and it was never, truly, an accurate description of what I had been all along. The people who hold a family together, quietly, without applause, without recognition, without their names ever appearing in the family's proud retelling of its own success, are not beneath anyone at all. They are, in the truest sense, the very reason everything else in that family manages to stand upright. But I also learned something equally important through all of this, that love without boundaries is not sacrifice. It is erasure. And no relationship, no family bond, no inherited sense of duty passed down through generations, is worth losing yourself completely for someone who was never willing, or never able, to see you clearly in return. If there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this story to carry with them, long after the video ends and their screen goes dark, it is this: your quiet strength is not an open invitation for others to take advantage of you. Being kind does not mean being invisible. Being supportive does not mean slowly disappearing, piece by piece, until one day someone calls you the bottom, and you realize, with a jolt, that you've spent years accepting a smaller version of your own worth without ever questioning it. You can love your family. You can help the people you care about, generously, wholeheartedly, the way I still choose to do even now. But you can do all of that while still holding on to your own worth at the very same time, without apology, without shrinking, without waiting for permission to matter. Somewhere, right now, watching this story unfold, there might be a version of you sitting quietly at your own family's table, holding up more weight than anyone around you realizes, being called the bottom, whether in those exact words or in 100 smaller, quieter ways, by someone who doesn't understand that without you, everything above them would simply collapse. I want you to know, wherever you are, whoever you are not the bottom. You are the foundation. And one day, when you finally find the courage to speak your truth, quietly and with steady confidence, the whole room will finally understand exactly who has been holding everything together all along.